Robert Duvall was halfway through a drive across rural Virginia when his truck died on a two-lane road and left him with nothing to do but wait. What he found in the garage he waited in, and what he chose to do about it, is a story that begins with a broken alternator and ends somewhere nobody expected. The truck stopped at 11:42 in the morning on a Tuesday in October 2001 on Route 231, about 4 miles outside a town called Brightwood, Virginia, population 812. The engine didn't seize or shudder. It simply went quiet in the particular way of machines that have been carrying a problem for some time and have reached the end of their patience with it. Duvall steered to the shoulder, sat for a moment with his hands on the wheel, and then reached for his phone. There was no signal. He got out of the truck, looked at the empty road in both directions, and started walking toward Brightwood. He found the garage on the main road, a two-bay operation called Hatcher's Auto, hand-painted sign, one lift occupied, the other empty, a faded Pennzoil banner across the front that had been there long enough to become part of the building's identity rather than its advertising. A radio was playing inside, country music, low, the kind of background that isn't really being listened to, but whose absence would be noticed. A pair of legs in work boots was visible beneath a truck on the occupied lift. Someone was working, and working without awareness of being observed, which was the first thing Duvall noted about the place. The mechanic's name was Earl Hatcher. He was 44 years old, third-generation Brightwood, had taken over the shop from his father 11 years earlier when the old man's knees gave out, and had been running it alone, with seasonal help from his nephew and year-round assistance from a parts supplier in Culpeper who made the drive out twice a week, since. He was, by every account of people who knew him, a man of profound competence in the specific domain of his work and very little interest in performing anything beyond it. He fixed what needed fixing. He charged what the job cost. He was done when he was done. He looked at the lean, older man who walked into his garage from the road, carrying nothing but a phone with no signal, and said, without preamble, "What happened?" Duvall told him. Earl Hatcher nodded, wiped his hands on a shop rag, and said he'd need to drive out and have a look. They drove out in Earl's truck, which smelled of motor oil and the particular kind of vinyl that absorbs decades of use and becomes something else entirely. Earl didn't make conversation on the way out. Duvall didn't push any. They drove the 4 miles to the stopped truck in a silence that was entirely comfortable, which is one of the faster ways to take a man's measure. Earl looked at the truck for 4 minutes. Then he stood up and said, "Alternator. Maybe the battery too, depending on how long it's been drawing. I've got the part. Give me until 3. It was 12:15. "I'll wait at the shop," Duvall said. Earl looked at him. "It's a 20-minute walk." "I know," Duvall said. Earl said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "There's coffee," which was the closest thing to an invitation he was going to offer, and Duvall accepted it as such. They drove back to the shop. The coffee was, as promised, bad. The particular brand of bad that comes from a pot that has been running since 6 in the morning and has not been refreshed since. Duvall drank it without comment and sat in the plastic chair near the entrance that was clearly designated as the waiting area by virtue of being the only chair not covered in something. He watched Earl work. This was, it turned out, interesting in a way that Duvall had not anticipated when he sat down. There was something in that garage that he had not been looking for and could not immediately name. He had been in a great many rooms over the course of a long life: rehearsal rooms, sound stages, hotel lobbies, studio conference rooms, the specific rooms that fame creates and that tend to have a similar quality of expectation about them regardless of their geography. This room had none of that quality. It smelled of motor oil and cold concrete and the particular mustiness of a space that has been used hard for a long time. And there was something present in it that was worth paying attention to, though he couldn't have said what it was yet. Not because of anything dramatic in the work itself. The diagnostic process and the repair that followed were technically unremarkable, the kind of job Earl had done several hundred times, and executed with the particular economy of motion that comes from doing something so many times that the body no longer needs to think about it. What was interesting was the quality of Earl's attention while he worked. It had the same quality that Duvall recognized from the very best actors he had known, a complete and unself-conscious absorption in the task, with no part of the mind available for performance or presentation, the whole of a person's capacity directed at the one thing in front of them. Duvall watched him for a long time. Around 1:30, Earl came out from under the hood and said the alternator was confirmed, and the battery was borderline, and he'd replace both to be safe. And did Duvall want the battery replaced, or just the alternator? Duvall said both. Earl nodded and went back to work. At 1:45, Duvall said, "How long have you been doing this?" Earl considered the question from under the hood. "Since I was 14, he said. "My father started me on oil changes." "Do you like it?" There was a pause of the kind that happens when someone is deciding whether a question deserves a real answer or a polite one. "Yes," Earl said. "I like finding what's wrong. Once you know what's wrong, the rest is just work." Duvall was quiet for a moment. "That's true of most things," he said. Earl came out from under the hood and looked at him, the first direct look he'd given the man in the waiting chair since they'd returned from the road. It was the look of someone recalibrating something. "What do you do?" Earl asked. "I'm an actor," Duvall said. Earl nodded, in the way of a man receiving information that is neither surprising nor particularly relevant to what he is currently doing. He went back under the hood. This was the part that Duvall later said he found most clarifying about the afternoon. Not the question, but the response to the answer. In most contexts, the information that he was an actor produced something in the person receiving it. Not always recognition, not always the specific recognition of his face and name, but a shift, a slight recalibration of the social register, the subtle adjustment that people make when they decide they are talking to someone whose category is different from their own. Earl Hatcher made none of these adjustments. He received the information that the man in his waiting chair was an actor with the same equanimity he would have received the information that he was a dentist or a retired postal worker, and returned to the alternator. It was, Duvall thought, genuinely refreshing, and more than that. It was the quality he had spent 50 years trying to bring into rooms that were designed to produce the opposite quality, rooms where everyone knew who everyone was and adjusted themselves accordingly. The absence of adjustment was, it turned out, clarifying. You could see a person more clearly when they weren't trying to be seen in a particular way. And what Duvall could see, watching Earl Hatcher work in the uncomplicated light of a rural Virginia garage on a Tuesday in October, was worth seeing. They talked more as the afternoon went on, not continuously, not in the way of people working to fill silence, but in the intermittent, unhurried way of two men in a room who have nowhere else to be and have found each other's company agreeable without having planned to. Earl talked about the shop, about the way the work had changed over 30 years as cars became more electronic and less mechanical, about his father, who had been able to diagnose an engine problem by sound alone, and whose ability Earl said he had spent 20 years trying to replicate and had never quite managed. Duvall talked about his own father, about growing up in San Diego, about the particular quality of competence that he had always found more interesting to watch than talent. At some point in the middle of the afternoon, Duvall asked about the photograph on the wall of the shop's small back office. Visible through the open door, a high school graduation photo, a young man in a cap and gown. Earl's answer was not what Duvall had expected. The young man in the photograph was Earl's son, Daniel. He was 19 now, had graduated the previous spring, and was working at a hardware store in Culpeper while he tried to figure out what came next. He wanted to study engineering, had wanted to for 3 years, Earl said, had the aptitude for it, had done well enough in school. But the money wasn't there, and the path from Brightwood, Virginia to an engineering degree was not a straight one. And Daniel was the kind of person who needed to see the path clearly before he would commit to walking it. Earl said all of this in the plain, factual way he said most things, without self-pity and without apparent expectation of a response beyond acknowledgement. He was not asking for anything. He was answering a question about a photograph. Duvall listened to all of it without interrupting, without offering the kind of immediate reflexive sympathy that the content might have warranted and that Earl clearly was not asking for. He listened the way he listened to everything that afternoon, with the quality of attention that Earl had brought to the alternator, complete and without reservation. There was something in what Earl had described that sat with him in a way he was not yet ready to do anything with. a 19-year-old who laid the carburetor pieces out in order on the floor, who had the aptitude and the desire and the particular kind of intelligence that expresses itself through understanding how things work, and who was sitting in a hardware store in Culpeper because the path from here to there wasn't visible enough to walk. Duvall listened to all of it. He did not say anything immediately. He sat in the plastic chair and looked at the graduation photograph through the open office door for a moment, and then he looked at Earl, who had gone back to the battery terminal. "Does Daniel know what kind of engineer he wants to be?" Duvall asked. "Mechanical, he thinks," Earl said. "He takes things apart to see how they work. Does it the same way I do." He paused. "Did it with my tools when he was 7, disassembled a carburetor, laid every piece out in order on the floor of the shop." Another pause. "Couldn't get it back together." "But the pieces were in order," Duvall said. Earl looked at him from under the hood. "Yes," he said. "They were." The truck was ready at 3:10. Earl wrote up the bill, parts and labor, fair to the point of being low, the kind of bill that a man charges when he is more interested in the work being right than in extracting maximum value from a situation. Duvall paid it. He shook Earl's hand. He got in the truck, backed it out of the bay, and drove away. 3 weeks later, a letter arrived at Hatcher's Auto from a Los Angeles address Earl didn't recognize. Inside was a handwritten note, 3 paragraphs, specific and practical, with information about 3 engineering scholarship programs, 2 of them with application deadlines still 6 weeks away, 1 with a Virginia residency preference that Earl hadn't known existed. There was also a name and a direct phone number, with a note that said the person at that number knew about these programs and had agreed to speak with Daniel if he called. At the bottom of the letter, a single line. The pieces were in order. That's the hardest part. The rest is just work. Earl Hatcher read the letter once standing at the shop entrance where he'd opened it, then carried it to the back office and read it again, sitting at the desk beneath the graduation photograph. The scholarship programs were real. He looked 2 of them up that evening on the family's computer. The Virginia residency preference on the 3rd one was real. The name and phone number at the bottom were real. He sat with all of this for a while before he picked up the phone. Earl Hatcher read the letter twice. Then he sat down in the plastic waiting chair, the one that had been occupied by a stranger for 3 hours on a Tuesday in October, and stayed there for a while without saying anything. He called Daniel in Culpeper. Daniel made the call. He applied to 2 of the 3 programs. He was accepted to both. He is an engineer. Earl Hatcher still has the letter. It's not framed. It's in the top drawer of the desk in the back office, beneath the graduation photograph, where he put it the afternoon it arrived and where it has remained every day since. He has taken it out occasionally, over the years, when something in a day's work has called for it. He has never told most people who wrote it, and on the occasions when someone has pressed him, he has given the same answer each time. The story, in his telling, doesn't need that part. It begins with a broken alternator and ends with a phone call his son almost didn't make, and everything in between is just a man who sat in a waiting chair, paid attention, and chose to do something with what he found there. If this story reminds you that paying attention to the person in the room is sometimes the most useful thing any of us can do, subscribe, leave a comment, and hit that notification bell. More stories about who these legends really were, away from the cameras and the credits, are coming every single week.